Hi, and welcome to this presentation of World War II, the Allied successes. This is the last of our three-part series that deals with World War II, but this is just the first of four mini presentations dealing with the Allied successes. These are notes 13.5a, and this is of course Mr. Marks. Take a moment so you can write down all of the key points. You need to know these or have these down in your notes. This presentation is largely going to talk about the turning points in the war. While the last couple presentations showed the Axis almost unstoppable in their movements, we saw in the last section of presentations that there were three areas that had started to cause the Axis a great deal of trouble. The first was Britain, who refused to surrender despite round-the-clock bombing for several months on not only Britain itself, but on its major city of London. You also had that Operation Barbarossa, where Hitler has now opened up another front against the Soviet Union, and it did not become the easy win that he had expected it to be. And also, because of Japan's bombing of the United States' naval base in Pearl Harbor, the United States has now also entered the conflict. These three main areas are what will lead to the eventual downfall of the Axis in World War II. One of the first of the turning points against the Axis is going to be the Second Battle of El Alamein. This is a major turning point in the North African Desert Campaign. Up until this time, Erwin Rommel, who is up in that top left-hand corner, had been largely unstoppable. He was the Desert Fox and had managed to outmaneuver the British time and again, victory after victory. This battle, though, which starts on October 23rd of 1942 and lasts until November 5th of the same year, will show the British now have the ability to defeat him. Now, there's probably three main reasons or three explanations that people look to as to why this unstoppable general suddenly finds himself on the retreat. The first is that the British are simply getting more supplies from the United States at this time. They've managed to deal with the German wolf packs that had been hunting down their convoys. The new invention of sonar had made it so submarines were much easier to detect. And you wouldn't think that submarines would affect a desert campaign, but because they allowed more troops and more supplies to get in there, it did have a large effect indeed. Secondly, the United States was now entering into the war itself, and a new general was really making his name known. His name was Dwight Eisenhower, and he's going to have success after success against Rommel. While they're never going to really meet head to head, Rommel will always end up retreating kind of one step away from him, from actually being captured. Eisenhower is going to manage to continually outfox the Desert Fox until the eventual surrender of the German troops in North Africa in May of 1943. The other reason that a lot of people who are fans of Rommel would say is that Hitler was starting to become a little afraid of Rommel's popularity. Rommel was this unbeatable general, and all these successes were gaining him a great deal of fame at home. For whatever reason, while Hitler would state it's because he needed the troops and supplies for his new front against the Soviet Union, a plan which Rommel had suggested against. A lot of people saw that the sudden lack of supplies and support in North Africa was actually a way of snubbing Rommel in order to make it so that he would lose. Well, if that was the case, it worked brilliantly because Rommel would eventually have to be called back to Germany to help its own defense against these now several fronts that Germany was facing. And as I mentioned earlier, his troops will end up surrendering in May of 1943. From that starting off point, now that North Africa is under Allied control, they're able to start ferrying troops across the Mediterranean from Tunisia into first Sicily. This is July of 1943. Allied troops land in Sicily, which, if you remember, Sicily is the island that if Italy is the boot, Sicily is the rock that the boot is kicking. And from there, they'll move into southern Italy. The Italians, seeing these Allied armies coming up on them and being rather sick of the fascist control of their country, overthrow Mussolini. They actually overthrow Il Duce. The new Italian government will sign an armistice with the Allies almost right away, but that does not end the fighting. Hitler, concerned that the Allies now have a means to go into Europe and attack Germany from the south, will send Nazi troops into Italy and to help meet up with Italian forces that were still loyal to Mussolini, and he'll send them in to actually rescue Mussolini and start up this defense. This will make very bloody and slow-moving fighting for the Allies. If the Allies were looking to use Italy as a fast means into Europe, they were going to be sorely mistaken. Many of the places in northern Italy are mountainous. This is where the Alps start up. And the Germans were able to find fortified locations in control of key mountain passes that made it so the Allies were not able to advance without taking costly numbers of casualties. For the next 18 months, the Allies are going to just slowly push up the Italian peninsula until they're largely blocked up at the Alps. Even though this doesn't give the Allies the kind of door to Europe that they were hoping they would, this was an operation designed by Eisenhower called Operation Torch, because it was supposed to light the fire of the Allied return to Europe. While it didn't do that, it still was a decisive event for the Allies because it forces Hitler to start fighting on a new front. He was already kind of fighting the British. He was now fighting the Eastern Front with the Soviets, and suddenly he has to deal with this new Southern Front, which will make it so he has to take troops and supplies away from the other fronts he was dealing with. Speaking of the Soviet front, the turning point for the Germans there is in the city of Stalingrad. This is probably one of the most costly battles of the entire war. Hitler wanted to take Stalingrad if for no other reason than because it was named after Stalin. And Stalin, for probably the same reason, wanted to defend it at all costs. In fact, Stalin actually had told his officers to shoot any soldier, any Russian soldier who retreated even one step. Now, these Russian soldiers were not well equipped. Quite often, they would be put into pairs. One of them would be given a gun because there weren't enough guns. The other one would be given the ammo. The one with the ammo was supposed to help the one with the gun keep firing the whole time, and if the one with the gun was shot, why, then the one with the ammo would now have a gun that he could pick up. It was that desperate for the Russians. But desperation sometimes leads to ingenious strategies. So when the Germans first surrounded the city, the Russians slowly started a retreat through the city, fighting block by block, building by building. In some cases, battles of 2 weeks would be fought over just a single building in Stalingrad. The Russians, as they did this slow retreat, kind of making it so the Germans would were actually laying a trap for themselves. They did that same scorched earth policy that they had used in the rest of Russia, where they destroyed any supplies and any chances of the Germans getting supplies from the areas that were surrendered. Meanwhile, the Russian generals, and they didn't count this as the retreat where they'd shoot their soldiers. They actually did this slow pulling back so that they could then encircle around the city themselves and now trap the Germans inside the city that doesn't have the food or supplies which they need. Cut off from their food and supplies with no hope for rescue, the German commander of Stalingrad will eventually surrender in early 1943. This battle will overall cost the Germans 300,000 wounded, killed, or captured soldiers. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army, Stalin's army, will take the offensive and will drive the invaders out of the Soviet Union entirely. Hitler's forces will suffer irreparable losses and of both men and machinery during this time. By early 1944, Soviet troops were starting their advance into Eastern Europe itself. On the western side, with Hitler so occupied with the Soviet Union, the Allies realized it was time for them to open up yet another front. They had one in Italy, they now had one over in Russia. They were going to create yet this other front in France. The only way to do this was to make a massive amphibious assault, to take their troops across the sea and to land them. The Germans, knowing this, had heavily fortified all of the beaches that were anywhere even close to landing sites that could be sent from England across that narrow English Channel. This is 1944, and Eisenhower has been given control of the entire Allied forces. He becomes the supreme Allied commander due to his many successes in North Africa. The Allies will choose June 6, 1944, a day that they refer to as D-Day. It's its code. They didn't want the actual date getting out anywhere. In fact, knowing that the Germans had cracked several of their codes, they would feed false information, including the wrong days and wrong landing zones, through those codes so that the Germans wouldn't expect this on the day that it came. Most troops had no idea what day this was going to be. They were all on ready notice for at any moment they could be taken up and sent across the channel. The Allies went so far as to actually build an inflatable fleet, which they kept a little bit further north than what you see on this map, so that the Germans thought that the landing was going to occur in that narrower section between France and England. You can actually kind of see that there on the map. It's not that far north. So on June 6th, just after midnight, Allied planes are going to do the largest airdrop that had been done up until that point in history. They're going to use a new type of force, which are paratroopers. These are people that are dropped out of airplanes, their parachutes open up, and they literally land behind enemy lines. The 101st Airborne is a large component of this. Their job is to take out any communications, any bridges, any means for the Germans to be able to reinforce the people that are fighting off on the beaches. At dawn, thousands of ships ferry 176,000 Allied troops across the English Channel. From these landing craft, like the one that's seen up there, troops have to fight their way on shore. And if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, that opening scene, that's very much what it was like on some of the bloodiest beaches. They had to deal with underwater mines. They had to deal with minefields, barbed wire, artillery fire, and worse, the machine gun nests which overlooked the beach. Securing there, they did one of the largest landings of troops and forces that had been seen in the world up till that time. This massive landing will allow the Allied troops to start moving their way through Normandy itself. They will finally break through the German defenses, and on August 25th, they will have control of Paris. Within a month after that, all of France will be under Allied control.